So because my last video did just so well, I thought I'd do something a little bit more low-key and less rant-filled and incoherent. So today I'm going to crate dig a little bit through my own vinyl collection, just kind of show you guys the stuff I'm into. Now I say some of the LPs I have because I have about 75 floating around over there total, and I've listened to maybe 3/4 of them because a lot of this stuff is what I got from my parents or grandparents or just random stuff I found that I haven't taken the time to listen to yet and I don't really care to listen to. So we're just going to go through my personal collection and some of my favorites that I've gotten over the years. So it wouldn't be a discussion about a vinyl collection without talking about the first album I ever bought, in I, Robot by the Alan Parsons Project. Now, this album isn't necessarily weird, especially in terms of 70s music or music that the Alan Parsons Project made, but it's easily their most accessible and successful album. Great tracks like I Wouldn't Want to Be Like You, Breakdown, and Genesis are all fantastic. Really heavy electronic sound that I personally really like. Alan Parsons is a genius when it comes to engineering. So excellent album, would highly recommend. This next one is one that I honestly didn't hear until about 2018, even though it was released in 2010. Brothers by the Black Keys is a fantastic album, especially if you're into garage rock. I know people tend to think that this is kind of when they went towards, a more pop sound, although El Camino is much more heavily pop focused. It's still a great album. The one weird thing that I'm super anal about, especially with this album, is with this being a double, you would think it would be a gatefold, right? Where it, opens up, has some nice art on the inside, one disc on one side, one on the other. But if you look here, there's nothing. It's just one sleeve for two discs. I don't know why the record label thought that would be a good idea, but it just makes no sense. How much extra would it have cost to make this a gatefold? I always feel like when I put this back in the sleeve that I'm ended up scratching the hell out of one, if not both of these, ding in the corner, stuff like that drives me absolutely insane. But if you're talking about the actual music, this is a fantastic album. If you like garage rock and haven't listened to the Black Keys, absolutely seek this album out. It is just excellent all the way through. Great production value, great tracks, excellent. Keeping on the theme, this is one I didn't know was going to be released until I saw it online. You probably don't know what this is. This is actually their most recent album, Let's Rock, and this was the 45 RPM, 180 gram that was released for Record Store Day earlier this year in 2020. Now, the thing with this album is, it really took me a while to get this, where before, like with Brothers, it was just straight garage rock. El Camino went into kind of more pop-focused sound, I suppose you could say, in terms of rock music, especially their sound. Turn Blue was not great. That album was just tonally all over the place. This one is a bit different. It focuses a lot more on that kind of acid rock and psychedelic sound that they hadn't explored before. But while doing that, they really do incorporate garage rock into that very well, I thought at least. Not many people consider this a great album. I'm not sure I consider it a great album, but it is a very good album. Highly recommend it. And I normally don't go for record store pressings because they're overpriced and just not very good, especially for what they are. This is a great pressing, especially with it being 45. The bass and kind of those heavier tonal sounds come through great, at least on my system. A few compilations that no one cares about. Oh, here we go. Collecting blues records is kind of strange because they're either exorbitantly expensive, in really rough shape, or both. But this is still one of my favorite albums just because of the soundscape of it. The Nocturne Blues by Taj Mahal. Now, for those of you who don't know who Taj Mahal is, I'm really not surprised. This was pretty much the only big album he had, but it's just straight, deep blues sound. Not Chicago or more so Delta, but it just comes through great. The guitar work is fantastic. The design is good, although it can kind of come off a bit thin in some places. Overall, a fantastic album. Highly recommend, especially if you're just getting into listening to blues music. Pick this up along with a few B.B. King albums, maybe. Great way to get introduced to the genre. Now we come to one of my favorite albums, and from what I understand, based on what I could find on Discogs, this is the rarest album I own. I don't buy that for a minute because you can still find this online. Morphine's Cure for Pain. This, for those of you who've never heard of Morphine, they were a pretty short-lived kind of rock jazz fusion, but not in like the Steely Dan level. It's just straight bari sax, 2-string bass guitar, and percussion work. And this, especially this pressing that Newberry Comics did in, I believe, 2019, is fantastic. It sounds so full, which really lends to, that soundscape of bari sax and 2-string bass. It is just a fantastic album. Can't recommend this enough. Highly recommend checking out the rest of their work. This is their best album by far. Highly recommend it. It's just so deep. If you like a real deep, heavy sound in your music, highly recommend checking this out. Great tracks. Buena, I'm Free Now, Ahead with Wings, Inspired Me. Thursday is probably their most, balls to the wall, heavy, just almost garage rock, in kind of its meaning behind it, but incorporates that deep sound so well. Highly recommend this. Okay, I'm not one for new age at all because it's just really not my style. It can be really all over the place, but Mike Oldfield's Tubular Bells is just a fantastic album. And for those of you who've never heard of Mike Oldfield before, go watch The Exorcist. The first bit off of this album is actually the theme for that and really kind of helps sell this album and Mike Oldfield in general. Great sound design. Mike Oldfield is just a fantastic multi-instrumentalist. Played every instrument on this track, and there's just a massive amount of instrumentation on this. Really comes off strong. Side 1 is better, but side 2 is great because it just goes absolutely nuts. Highly recommend. So of course, you can't talk about a vinyl collection without talking about Dark Side. Is there really anything else that can be said about this album that hasn't been said already by everyone under the sun who are infinitely more qualified than me? It's essential. I mean, having Dark Side is absolutely essential, especially if you're into classic rock when you're getting into vinyl. And it really is worth picking up some kind of pressing for it. I have yet to hear a bad pressing. I've heard the MoFi pressings are excellent. The early pressings are surprisingly good, even if they aren't in the best shape. Like, I have a third pressing over there that was released in 1975 or 76 that still sounds excellent. You give it a little cleaning, an old record can go a long way, and they really do hold up. And also, Wish You Were Here. The funny thing about Wish You Were Here, I think, is that while Dark Side is my favorite album of all time, and in my opinion, the best album of all time, this is Pink Floyd's best album, which probably makes no sense, but this tells a bit more of a story than Dark Side does. For those of you who don't know, this is inspired mostly by Syd Barrett's Mental Breakdown, or at least that's what everyone seems to think it's about. I can't really verify that, but it's great. Leading in with Shine On You Crazy Diamond and leaving with it is a great start and finish to an album. And In Between is also great. Welcome to the Machine is fantastic. Have a Cigar is great if you kind of like a really good groove to your music. And Wish You Were Here, of course, while personally, that track doesn't do much for me, mainly because it's been played to death forever. It still is a great track. Highly recommend both of these albums if you're getting into Pink Floyd and vinyl collecting. Talk about The Wall, but I don't really care. It's a great album, just I would probably put that at 4th or 5th in terms of my favorite Floyd albums. I mean, they've just made so much great music. It's hard to kind of rank it, at least in my opinion. All right, now we're going to start getting into new wave a bit more. And by new wave, I really do mean post-punk. There were two separate movements that came out of the New York underground music scene in the late 70s and early 80s. But one of my favorites out of that time period that came out of that sound is the debut album by Pretenders. Now, this is probably their most well-known album, but it didn't have a lot of singles outside of Brass in Pocket that did real well. But this, I think, is kind of one of the epitome albums of new wave and late post-punk, where it combines kind of a harder edge sound with some different instrumentations, kind of an amalgamation of different kind of rock sounds, garage rock, new wave, punk, post-punk. It's all there, and it's great on this album. The vocal work by Chrissie Hynde is fantastic. in my opinion, one of the most talented vocalists out of this time period, and one of the most underrated because Blondie, or Debbie Harry rather, overshadowed them. Great album. I recommend it. You're getting into this sound. This one can probably come a little bit later. We'll get into the ones you start with in just a minute, but still great album. Recommend it. You can find this dirt cheap on Discogs. There's probably a few sitting at your local record store. I would recommend it though. Great album. Okay, and now we're going to get into one of the most polarizing pressings I have. While Run the Jewels 4 is a fantastic album and is my personal album of the year for 2020 between this and Aman by Slift, this is a really, really bad pressing. There's so much surface noise on this that I don't know if it was an issue with the manufacturing of it. It just pops and clicks everywhere. I threw a brand new cartridge on my turntable. It still had a lot of pops, clicks, and hisses. The sound design and soundscape is just all over the place. The noise floor is really, really high, which for this album, with how heavy and deep and hard hitting it is, really does not lend it any favors. There are times where really, I don't want to say really light tracks, but lighter tracks by the standards of this album come through way too strong, and really heavy sounds like Holy Calamafuck just come off way too strong, where it would work even if it were reverse, where the lighter ones kind of come off a bit heavier and the heavier ones come off a little bit lighter, but it's just way too heavy. It's almost off-putting. And I love Run the Jewels sound, but it's just too heavy for my taste. Fantastic album, bad pressing. I've heard the limited edition ones that were released for like $100 were pretty solid, but I just can't recommend this. And it's really disappointing because this is such a great album. I wish I could, but I can't. I don't know. I'm still torn whether I want to call this one of the most underrated albums of all time, because this is this group's most recognized and successful album. 12 Dreams of Dr. Sardonicus by Spirit. This is just a fantastic album. Fantastic. Borders on prog rock, acid rock, or psychedelic, whatever you want to call it. It's just fantastic. While it doesn't really have a real interesting or diverse soundscape, what they do on this album is done very, very well. And it kind of leaves you with this strong emotional impact, because there are some really deep meaning tracks on this album, especially ones like Love Has Found a Way and Life Has Just Begun, that just leave, at least me personally, feeling really full and emotionally fulfilled. And I love having that when it comes to music. And also, if anything, this was the first album that I would say it was kind of a strange one. While like one of the first albums I listened to was Dark Side, and I thought that was strange. This is a little bit out there in terms of kind of a dominant, more well-known rock sound. Highly recommend though. It's just a fantastic album. One of my personal favorites. Now, this one has a really deep meaning to me. This is one of the first albums like I could recognize when I was like 3 years old. T for the Tillerman by Cat Stevens. I know Cat Stevens gets a lot of grief because, kind of a poppy, wannabe folk sound. This album, though, is fantastic. The sound design and soundscape of this album is just absolutely fantastic, especially with the combination of guitar and piano work. It just comes off sounding really full and rich, which kind of, in my opinion, doesn't happen a lot with folk music and folk rock. Comes off great on this album. This is just an absolute classic any way you slice it, in my opinion. Highly recommend checking this out. Fantastic work. So you remember how I said there are some albums you should seek out if you're getting into new wave? These are two of them. So this is Remain in Light by Talking Heads, and this is their follow-up album, Speaking in Tongues. These are both just absolute classics across any genre or subgenre. Especially Remain in Light. While I honestly do prefer Speaking in Tongues because just of how deep and heavy and funk-based the sound is on this album, Remain in Light is an incredible album. The production by Brian Eno on this album is just absolutely fantastic. Especially the title track, Born Under Punches, with some really interesting electronic instrumentation work, is fantastic. It starts off it hits the ground running and just does not let up until this album stops. Fantastic, excellent design. Now, with Speaking in Tongues, I think this was their second or most commercially successful album because it was a combination of post-punk, new wave, world beat, and dance rock. That was why it was so successful. It included everything that they did well on Remain in Light and just turned it up into a more accessible dance rock sound. Highly recommend both of these albums, but if you're going to choose one, I would say this. It's a bit more accessible and I think is a really good gateway outside of Stop Making Sense into the Talking Heads discography. So, and now everyone's favorite band to rip on, U2 and their, in my opinion, best album, The Joshua Tree. This kind of stuck out as a more traditional rock album. You know, kind of typical guitar and percussion work. The bass work is pretty solid, albeit really underutilized in my opinion. I really do enjoy it. If you're going to pick one U2 album to listen to, I'd highly recommend this one. Now into the second album I ever bought. So, Hot Rats by Frank Zappa is easily his best work, and this is an incredible album. One of the best of all time, in my opinion, and easily his most accessible. Kind of goes into the range of jazz fusion, and the instrumentation is excellent. Sounds really full, really dynamic, excellently mastered. Can't say enough about this album. I'll real briefly talk about these two because these are some of the most iconic albums across any genre of all time. And those are A Love Supreme by John Coltrane and Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. You know, these are kind of like the jazz equivalent of Dark Side, in my opinion. These are two absolutely essential albums if you're looking to get into jazz. They are really accessible, especially Kind of Blue. They are really full. The instrumentation is excellent, especially on A Love Supreme. Production is fantastic. So Melt by Peter Gabriel was his third album. This is where he really started to take off in terms of his sound, in my opinion, before he went into kind of a pop sound with So, which is by no means a bad album. This is excellent, really dynamic, really weird, honestly, in terms of the vocal work and instrumentation. Highly recommend it, though. Great album. So this next one is one of the most legendary one-hit wonder albums of all time, which isn't really fair because they only made one album. Layla and Other Assorted Love Songs by Derek and the Dominoes. No, not by Eric Clapton. The sound design is good, not great. I think it could have been a little bit more fuller, kind of lend into that blues rock sound a bit more. But that being said, it's still a fantastic album. And in my opinion, the best, well, second best thing outside of Blind Faith that Eric Clapton did. So this one I actually got a little bit ago for nothing. John Barleycorn Must Die by Traffic. This is easily their best and most focused album, especially side one. Side two, it kind of peters off into more slow-moving prog. This is a great album. Great tracks off it. Glad, Freedom Rider, Empty Pages, Stranger to Himself. Excellent album. Highly recommended. So let me know down below what some of your favorite albums of all time are and if you're as big a vinyl person as I am. Now, what I showed you guys is not anywhere close to my full collection, and my full collection is nowhere near as big as some people's. I wanted to put this out there because of how important music is to me. It is the one constant I have and one pulse that I don't know what I would do without. So leave a like and comment down below, and I will see you guys next time.